The sound of crackling energy filled the air as Captain Roland stepped cautiously through the ruins of the ancient city. It had been centuries since the last battle here, but the scars of war still clung to every broken stone and shattered wall. His boots echoed against the hollow structures, a reminder that he was alone, save for his AI companion, Ro, who spoke in his ear every few minutes. "Captain, there's nothing here but ruins. Let's move on." Roland's brow furrowed as he scanned the surroundings. The city was old, far older than any human civilization. Yet there was something about it, something in the air, that made him feel as though he wasn't the first to visit. His fingers brushed against a weathered wall, trying to decipher the alien symbols carved into the stone. The shapes were unfamiliar, but the sense of dread they gave off was all too clear. "Just a few more minutes, Roland murmured, more to himself than the AI. His curiosity had led him to this forgotten place, but now something else pulled at him, something deeper. Then he saw it. At the center of the city's main square, standing tall amidst the ruins, was a massive pillar, black, smooth, and devoid of any markings. It looked out of place, almost as if it were not of this world. There was an energy around it, something that made Roland's skin prickle. The pillar stretched high into the sky, its top lost in the mist that hung heavy over the city. Do a scan." "What is this?" "Analyzing." "Captain, this object is emitting a low-frequency energy. It is not of human design." Roland's instincts tingled. He could feel the weight of something old and forgotten, something powerful, lurking near this pillar. He moved closer, his hand hovering over his blaster as he approached the base. The stone beneath his feet was worn smooth from centuries of neglect, yet there was a sense of life within the air. As he reached the pillar, a faint whisper reached his ears, as though carried on the wind. He paused, listening. It was a voice, soft, desperate, and very much alive. His heart raced, and he quickly surveyed the area. Nothing. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." Roland's eyes widened. He wasn't alone. There was someone here. "Any signs of life?" he asked, though he was already sure of the answer. "Captain, there is no biological signature nearby. The readings are... Wait. There is something faint. At the pillar's base. It doesn't match any known life form we've encountered." The urgency in Ro's voice pushed Roland forward. He approached the pillar with slow, measured steps, scanning it for any indication of where the voice was coming from. And then he saw her. At the foot of the pillar, a figure lay slumped against the stone. She was bound in strange, glowing chains that wrapped around her body, holding her in place. Her limbs were shackled by thick, glowing metal that pulsed with an eerie energy. Her hair, a brilliant shade of silver, cascaded around her shoulders, and her eyes, though closed, seemed to burn with an intensity that stopped Roland in his tracks. The woman's skin shimmered, almost as though it were made of light itself, but it was her eyes, dark, violet, and filled with a deep, aching sorrow, that drew him in. Who are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the figure before him. Her eyes opened, and Roland froze. The world seemed to stop for a moment as her gaze locked onto his. "I am Vale." Her voice was low, but powerful. There was a softness to it, a vulnerability, yet an undeniable strength. You're not supposed to be here." Roland felt his chest tighten. There was something about her, something in the way she spoke, that suggested her captivity wasn't just a matter of imprisonment. It was a symbol. He moved forward, inspecting the chains that held her. The energy was unlike anything he had ever seen, and his fingers itched to break them, to free her from whatever had bound her for so long. But something stopped him, an unease that settled in his gut. "Who did this to you?" Val's eyes flashed with something fierce. "The Dominion. They thought I was a traitor. They imprisoned me here, left me to die." Roland's mind raced. The Dominion. He had heard of them. A ruthless empire that conquered worlds enslaved species, and destroyed anyone who opposed them. But why her? Why was she here, on this forgotten planet, bound to this pillar? Why were you imprisoned? He asked, crouching beside her. Her expression hardened, and she spoke with such venom that it made Roland flinch. I refused to give them what they wanted. Which was humanity's location. The words hung in the air for a moment. Roland felt a chill creep up his spine. If she had refused the Dominion, if they had been hunting humanity, that meant something far greater was at play here. Roland swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the glowing chains. There was no going back now. He could feel it. The pull to help her, to right whatever wrongs had been done. And in that moment, as if sensing his resolve, Val's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. You freed me. Now, I swear, I will make them pay. Roland didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of her words hung in the air like a promise, one that would echo across the stars, reshaping the fate of countless lives. With a deep breath, he reached out, his hand pressing against the energy of the chains. There was no turning back now. Roland carefully examined the strange chains that bound Val. They shimmered with an alien energy, their glow faint but persistent. As his fingers brushed against them, a jolt of electricity shot through his body, and he quickly pulled back. The power was intense, more than anything he had ever encountered. He couldn't help but wonder how Val had survived this long, trapped in such a way. You weren't meant to survive, were you? Roland asked quietly, his eyes meeting hers. Val didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the chains, her lips pressed tightly together, as if she were weighing something important. Then, with a soft sigh, she nodded. No, her voice was low, tinged with sorrow. But there was also a quiet strength in her words. The Dominion meant for me to die here, forgotten and alone. They thought they could break me, but they underestimated something in me. Roland didn't know what to say to that. Instead, he focused on the chains. He couldn't free her without understanding how they worked. Ro, do a full scan of the chains. I need to know what we're dealing with here. Understood, Captain. Scanning now. Roland watched as the holographic screen flickered to life before him. The chains were made of an unknown material, and the energy they emitted was unlike anything in the human database. It was a combination of quantum energy and a unique alien metal. Breaking it would require a delicate process, one he wasn't equipped for. He cursed under his breath. There was no way he could cut through the chains with just his tools. But then a thought crossed his mind. Val, he said, looking back at her, what if you could? Help me. If you know these chains, maybe you can use your abilities to weaken them. Val's eyes flickered with something, perhaps surprise, perhaps hope. But then she looked away, her expression hardening again. I can't. Her voice was almost a whisper, as if admitting something painful. The energy that holds me here is too strong. If I try, it will only destroy me further. Roland's heart sank. It was clear that she had tried everything she could, but nothing had worked. He had to do this. He took a deep breath, running his fingers along the pillar's surface, trying to find some weakness in the structure that would allow him to free her. But it was solid, unyielding. I know you're scared. He spoke gently, trying to reassure her. But you don't have to do this alone. We can figure this out, together. Val looked up at him then, her violet eyes searching his face. There was something in her gaze, something that softened, even if just for a moment. She had been alone for so long, abandoned by everyone she once trusted. Maybe, just maybe, this human, this stranger, could offer her a glimmer of hope. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice sharp with caution, though a hint of vulnerability lingered beneath. I want to help you, Roland replied. And maybe, together, we can make the Dominion pay for what they've done to you. Val stared at him for a long while, weighing his words. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she nodded. If you truly mean that, then I will not stop you. Roland didn't know what had changed in her, but something had. She was willing to trust him, at least for now. It was a fragile trust, but it was enough. Without another word, Roland stepped back and opened a small compartment on his wrist device. A tiny drone emerged, hovering in front of him. The little machine whirred to life, scanning the chains and sending data back to Roland's wrist display. He adjusted the settings, trying to find a way to disrupt the chain's energy field. As the drone worked, Roland turned his attention to Vale. Her posture had shifted slightly. She looked a little less defeated, a little more alive. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Too long." Vale's voice carried a weight that made Roland's heart ache. "I lost count after the first century, but I never gave up. Not completely." Roland nodded. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." There was silence between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though they had found an unspoken understanding. Roland knew that whatever Vale had endured, it had forged her into something unbreakable, something far beyond what he had expected when he first found her. The drone beeped, signaling that it had completed its scan. "Captain, I have identified the weak points in the chains. A focused electromagnetic pulse should weaken their hold on her." "Great," Roland muttered, studying the data. "But we'll need to be quick. The Dominion will have noticed the disturbance in their systems by now." Val's eyes darkened at the mention of the Dominion. "They are relentless. If they're aware of our presence, they will come for us. And they will not stop until we're dead." Roland glanced at the pillar. "I don't plan on being caught." He turned back to her, his face hardening with resolve. "Stay close to me. I'll get you out of here, and then we'll take the fight to them. The Dominion won't know what hit them." Vale studied him, something like amusement dancing in her eyes for a moment. "You humans, you are foolishly brave." "That's what they say," Roland said with a grin. "And they're right." With that, he quickly began to adjust his wrist device, preparing the pulse. The air around them seemed to grow thicker with tension as the moment to act drew nearer. "Are you ready?" Roland asked. Vale gave him a sharp, determined nod. "Let's end this." With a final flick of his wrist, Roland sent the pulse toward the chains. The result was immediate. The chains trembled as the energy field surrounding them flickered and sputtered. Vale gasped as the glowing metal weakened, the hold on her slowly breaking. The light in her eyes grew brighter, her breath coming faster. For the first time in over a century, Vale was free. And she wasn't about to waste this second chance. The moment the chains dissolved into nothingness, Vale staggered to her feet. Her muscles, long unused, trembled beneath her, but she didn't collapse. Instead, she stood tall, her posture proud, as if every step she took was a step toward reclaiming her freedom. Roland watched in awe, his eyes taking in the sight of her. He had seen strength before, but the way she carried herself, like someone who had endured the worst of pain and still stood unbroken, was different. It was more than strength. It was a kind of resilience he hadn't known was possible. "Are you all right?" Roland asked, his voice laced with concern. Vale didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She flexed her hands, letting the freedom of movement soak in. Finally, she met Roland's gaze. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of something unspoken. "For the first time in a long time, I feel free." Roland nodded. "Good, because we're not out of danger yet." Val's expression darkened at his words, and for the first time, she seemed truly present in the moment, not lost in the memories of her imprisonment. "You're right," she said quietly. "The Dominion will come for us. They won't leave us alone." Roland glanced around, taking in their surroundings. The ruined city stretched out in all directions, silent and empty, yet somehow it felt like they were being watched. He could sense it, an uneasy tension in the air, as though the very walls of the city were waiting for something. Or someone. "Then we need to leave," Roland said, turning to his ship. "Now." Vale hesitated, her eyes scanning the area with a practiced wariness. She wasn't used to having allies, and she wasn't used to trusting anyone. But something about Roland felt different. He had freed her when no one else had dared, and he was offering something she hadn't had in so long: hope. "Lead the way," she said at last, her voice firm. Roland didn't hesitate. He turned and began walking toward the ship, trusting her to follow. They had no time to waste. Every second they spent in the ruins brought them closer to the inevitable Dominion forces that were no doubt already tracking their every move. The trek to the ship was quick, but Roland couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He kept his hand close to his sidearm, ready for anything. The ruined city stretched out before them like a maze, and every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown. Vale moved with a quiet grace, her steps light but sure, as if she knew exactly where she was going, even after all these years. When they reached the ship, Roland immediately activated the ramp. The moment the door opened, he ushered Vale inside, followed by a rush of urgency. As they stepped inside, Roland quickly closed the ramp, sealing them off from the outside world. "Row, engage cloaking mode and prepare for takeoff," Roland ordered, his voice sharp. "Engaging cloaking mode now, Captain," Row responded, its mechanical voice calm. As always, the ship hummed to life, its engines powering up, and within moments they were lifting off the ground, rising above the ruins. As the city shrank beneath them, Roland turned to Vale, who was already sitting in the cockpit, staring out at the stars. "We're not safe yet," Roland said, his voice steady. "The Dominion will have detected the energy disruption. We have a head start, but it won't last." Val's eyes remained on the stars, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "The Dominion isn't just an enemy. They are an empire that has conquered and enslaved countless species. They won't stop until they've crushed every last bit of resistance." Roland leaned forward, resting his elbows on the console. "Then we fight back. Together." Vale turned to him then, her gaze intense. "I fought alone for so long, Captain. You don't know what it's like." Roland met her gaze, his eyes steady. "No, I don't. But I've seen what the Dominion does to people. I've seen their cruelty. You don't have to fight alone anymore." For a moment, Val's expression softened. There was a flicker of something. Vulnerability, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She nodded, though. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I've lived in the shadows for so long, I've forgotten what it feels like to stand in the light." "You're not alone now," Roland said, his voice firm. "You have me." Vale didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her attention back to the stars outside the ship. She seemed lost in thought, her mind racing with possibilities. The ship's engines hummed smoothly, carrying them farther from the planet. The view of the galaxy stretched before them, beautiful, vast, and full of potential. For the first time, Vale allowed herself to imagine something beyond the fight. What could they accomplish together? What if they could bring down the Dominion? Roland broke the silence. "We need a plan." Vale nodded, her expression hardening. "We'll need to find out everything we can about the Dominion's operations. I can't fight them blind. But if we expose their secrets, if we show the galaxy what they really are, we might stand a chance." Roland smiled. "That's the plan. First, we find a way to reach their data vault. The Dominion's secrets are buried there." Vale looked at him, an unreadable expression on her face. "You've thought this through." Roland shrugged. "I've had time to think, and I'm not going into this blind. We'll need all the information we can get if we're going to make a real dent in their empire." Val's lips curled into a slight smile. "I like you, Captain." Roland grinned back. "I'm glad. We've got a long road ahead." As the stars streaked past them, Vale felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, She felt like she was on the right side of it. The stars outside the ship blurred as they sped through space. Roland remained at the controls, his focus unbroken as he guided the ship through the dark void. He had a plan now, one that he believed could change everything. But plans meant little without action, and that meant they needed to gather information, resources, and allies. He glanced over at Vale, who was seated across from him, her arms folded as she stared out the viewport. The way she held herself was different now, less like a prisoner and more like someone who had reclaimed their purpose. But her eyes still held shadows, things unsaid that Roland could feel but never truly understood. "How long until we reach the rendezvous point?" Vale asked, her voice low but steady. Roland tapped a few buttons on his console, checking their position. "A few hours. We should be there before nightfall. Local time." "Local time." Vale raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Where exactly are we going?" Roland hesitated for just a second before answering. He had been planning this for some time, but telling Vale the truth now felt important. "We're going to a hidden base on the edge of the Calda system. It's one of the last places the Dominion hasn't discovered, a safe haven for those who have fought back." Val's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing for a long moment. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice almost a whisper. "And you trust these people?" Roland turned to face her, his eyes serious. "They'd helped me before. I wouldn't trust them with my life if they didn't. They're fighters, just like you." There was a quiet weight in the air between them as Vale processed his words. She didn't speak for a while, but Roland could tell that she was considering something deeply. Finally, she spoke. "I don't trust easily, Captain. Not anymore. But for you, I will." Her voice softened. "You're giving me a chance to fight back, to stand again." Roland gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Her gaze shifted back to the stars. "Then let's see if your allies can help us." Hours passed in silence as the ship cruised toward the Calda system. Roland kept his focus on the journey, though his thoughts often drifted to the unknowns ahead. The Dominion was vast, its reach endless, and while the Calda system was a sanctuary for those hiding from its grasp, it was only a matter of time before the Dominion found it, if they hadn't already. The ship emerged from warp, and the blue hues of the Calda system's outermost planets greeted them. But there was no time to admire the view. Roland activated the cloaking systems once again, ensuring that they remained hidden from any potential Dominion patrols. "I'll get us through," Roland muttered to himself as he navigated through the dense asteroid field. Val's voice interrupted his concentration. "Are you sure they'll be able to help us? The Dominion's grip is strong. Stronger than you think." Roland's hands tightened on the controls, but he didn't look up. "They will. They have resources, hidden ones, and they're fighting for the same thing we are." There was another long pause before Vale spoke again. This time, her voice carried a hint of something else, something almost vulnerable. "I haven't fought with others in so long. I don't know what it's like to have someone watch my back." Roland finally turned his head to look at her. "You'll learn, and you'll be one of the best fighters they've ever seen. You've got something they'll respect." Her eyes met his for a moment, and though she didn't smile, the tension in her body seemed to loosen slightly. The base was hidden on one of the moons orbiting the Calda system's largest planet. It was a quiet place, surrounded by asteroids and debris, making it hard to spot from afar. Roland expertly piloted the ship through the narrow gaps in the asteroid field, the ship's cloaking technology ensuring that they went unnoticed by any external scans. As they approached the base, a faint signal appeared on Roland's screen. The base was sending a coded message, confirming their arrival. Roland responded with a quick sequence of codes, and the base's security systems lowered their shields, allowing them to land. The ship's engines hummed as they descended through the moon's atmosphere, eventually touching down on the rocky surface. "Welcome to the Calda outpost," Roland said as he powered down the engines. "Stay close, Vale. We don't know how much the Dominion knows about this place." Vale nodded, her expression serious but focused. She was already moving toward the exit of the ship, her mind sharp and alert. Let's get this done. Roland followed her, stepping out into the dry, rocky terrain of the moon. The air was thin, but the atmosphere was breathable, just barely. The small outpost lay ahead, a series of low buildings hidden beneath the surface of the moon. It was the perfect hiding spot, blending seamlessly with the surroundings. As they approached the entrance, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. A tall man, his face obscured by a hood, regarded them with a sharp gaze. He didn't speak at first, but Roland recognized the man immediately. "Kel," Roland said, offering a nod. The man's eyes flicked briefly to Vale before returning to Roland. "Roland, it's been a while." His voice was deep, with a hint of suspicion. "What brings you back to the outpost?" Roland didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need your help. We've got a problem with the Dominion. Big one." Kel's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. "That's never a small request. What's the situation?" Roland glanced at Vale before answering. "This is Vale. She's someone the Dominion wants dead, and I need everything you've got on them. It's time we hit them where it hurts." Cale studied Vale for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, come inside. We'll discuss the plan." As they moved toward the entrance, Roland felt a surge of determination. With Cal's help, and the resources of the outpost, they had a real shot at taking the fight to the Dominion. But as they entered the base, Roland knew one thing for sure. The real battle was only just beginning. The base was quieter than Roland expected. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of fear. It was the silence of people who were always ready. Ready for a fight. Ready for something to go wrong. The walls were bare except for small screens showing maps and scans of various systems. A few workers were huddled in corners, talking in low voices. Cale led them to a small room at the back, where a large table dominated the center. Maps of various star systems were pinned to the walls, and holographic screens displayed real-time data. "Take a seat," Cale said, gesturing to the chairs around the table. Roland and Vale sat across from him, both silent, waiting for the other to speak. "You said you needed help with the Dominion," Cale started. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "What kind of help?" Roland leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need information. They've got something big, and we need to know what it is. The Dominion is getting stronger. We can't let them keep expanding." Val's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in as well. "They've taken too many planets already. I was a part of their experiments. They'll do anything to break us." Cal's gaze flicked to her, his eyes assessing. "I've heard rumors about their experiments, but nothing solid. If you've been through it, you probably know more than anyone else." Roland spoke next, his voice low but steady. "We're looking for a way to strike back, to hurt them where it matters." Cale nodded slowly. "All right, I've got a few things that might help. But first, we need to know how serious you are about this. Taking down the Dominion isn't something you can do halfway. It's not a small fight." Vale didn't flinch, her eyes unwavering as she stared at him. "I've been fighting the Dominion for longer than you can imagine. I'm not afraid of them. And neither is Roland." Roland glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. He had noticed how her confidence was growing since they'd escaped from the prison. It was like something in her had awakened, a fire that had been dormant for so long. "I'm in this for the long haul," Roland said, his voice firm. Cale studied them both for a long moment before standing and walking over to a terminal in the corner of the room. He punched in a few codes, and a map of the Dominion's outermost systems appeared on the screen. He zoomed in on a small, heavily guarded installation. "This is where the Dominion's been focusing their efforts," Cale said, pointing at the base. "It's a research facility, but it's not just any facility. They'd been experimenting with different kinds of weapons, and from what we've gathered, they're trying to create something deadly." Roland's heart sank. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made the reality even worse. The Dominion wasn't just expanding, it was preparing for something big, something that could end the war before it even began. "How do we get in?" Vale asked, her voice steady. Cale didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up more data on the facility, showing its defenses, the security systems, and the number of soldiers stationed there. It was a heavily fortified location, with multiple layers of protection. They would need more than just stealth to get inside. "You don't," Cale said at last. "Not directly, anyway. The Dominion's security is too tight." Roland felt a pang of frustration. They had come all this way, and now Cale was telling them it wasn't possible. But then Cale's voice softened, and he added, "But I know someone who can help, a former Dominion officer who defected. She has information about their inner workings, and she might be able to give us a way in." Roland leaned forward. "How do we find her?" Cale pulled up a profile of the woman. "Her name's Lysandra. She's hiding out in the outer reaches. It'll take some time to get to her, but if she's willing to talk, she'll have the answers we need." Val's eyes narrowed. "And you trust her?" "I trust her enough," Cale replied. "She's helped us before, but she won't come easily. She's been in hiding for years, and she's not exactly eager to jump into a fight with the Dominion again." Roland stood up, a sense of determination filling him. "We don't have time to waste. If Lysandra can help us, we need to find her now." Cale nodded. "I'll prepare a ship for you. But be careful. If the Dominion knows about her, they'll come after her. And they won't stop until they get what they want." The journey to the outer reaches was longer than Roland had expected. The farther they traveled from the center of the galaxy, the more isolated and dangerous the systems became. There were no signs of the Dominion, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. As they neared the coordinates Cal had given them, Roland couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back now. They needed Lysandra, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get the information they needed. Vale sat in the back of the ship, her arms crossed as she stared out the window, lost in thought. Roland could sense her unease, but she didn't voice it. She wasn't one for small talk, especially not when her mind was focused on something else. The fight was always on her mind. "You okay?" Roland asked as he glanced back at her. Vale didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a quiet breath and looked at him. "I've never been good at trusting people," she said. "But something about you. I don't know. I'm starting to believe that we might actually be able to do something." Roland gave her a small smile. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a team." Vale didn't smile back, but there was a shift in her eyes, something softer, something almost human. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next attack. She was ready for what came next. The ship touched down on a small barren moon just as the sun began to set. The orange light of the distant star cast long shadows across the jagged surface, creating an eerie atmosphere. Roland and Vale stepped out, scanning their surroundings. "There's no turning back now," Roland muttered, his hand on his sidearm. Vale nodded, her expression unreadable. She was ready. They both were. Ahead of them, hidden in the shadow of a canyon, was the entrance to a small settlement. The doors were heavily reinforced, but the insignia was old, worn down by years of neglect. They had arrived at the right place. Now they just needed to find Lysandra. The settlement was quiet. Too quiet, Roland thought. The buildings, though sturdy, seemed abandoned, their exteriors covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the cracked ground. Roland glanced over at Vale, who was scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes, every movement calculated and precise. She didn't speak, but the tension was clear between them. "Stay close," Roland whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "If anyone's watching, we can't afford to be seen." Vale gave a sharp nod, her hand instinctively reaching for the blaster holstered at her side. The faint hum of her weapon's power core was the only sound that accompanied them as they moved forward, slipping between the dilapidated structures. Roland led the way, keeping his senses alert for any sign of danger. They had to find Lysandra, and they had to do it fast. The Dominion's reach stretched farther than they realized. They couldn't afford to waste time. They reached the entrance to a building at the far end of the settlement. The door was old, but still functional, and Roland pressed a button beside it. The door slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a dimly lit corridor inside. "After you," Roland said, stepping aside to let Vale enter first. She didn't need to be told twice. Vale slipped inside without hesitation, her steps light but purposeful. Roland followed close behind, his hand resting on his blaster as he surveyed the hallway. At the end of the corridor, a single door stood slightly ajar. Roland could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were so close to finding Lysandra, if she was even here. The thought of walking away empty-handed was unbearable. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room was small, with only a single table in the center and a few chairs scattered around. It was clear that the place had been used recently. Roland's eyes immediately locked on the woman sitting at the far end of the table. She was tall, with dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes, though tired, still carried a sharpness that suggested she was always aware of her surroundings. "Lysandra?" Roland asked, his voice low. The woman didn't respond at first, her eyes studying them both. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm Lysandra. And you must be Roland, the rebel captain." Roland didn't flinch at the words. He had heard them before, and they didn't bother him anymore. He simply nodded and stepped forward. "We need your help," he said, his voice steady. "The Dominion's working on something, and we need to know what it is. Something big, something dangerous." Lysandra's eyes flicked briefly to Vale, then back to Roland. "Dangerous," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That's an understatement. The Dominion has always been dangerous. But what you're asking for, it's not something I can just hand over." Roland felt his frustration rising. "I don't have time for games. If you have the information we need it now." Lysandra held up a hand, signaling for him to calm down. "I'm not playing games, but you're asking me to trust you, and that's not something I do easily." Her gaze softened slightly. "The Dominion's been hunting me for years. They've sent people to kill me, to bring me back. And you think I'll just help you without asking why?" Roland clenched his jaw. He understood her hesitation, but they didn't have the luxury of time. "We're fighting for the same thing, Lysandra. The Dominion has to be stopped, or there won't be anything left to save. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to help me stop them." Lysandra remained silent for a long moment, her eyes flicking between Roland and Vale. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I've seen what the Dominion is capable of," she said quietly. "I was once one of them, remember? I know how they think, how they operate. And what they're doing now, it's worse than anything you could imagine." Roland's pulse quickened. "What are they doing?" Lysandra took a deep breath. "They're creating a weapon that can destroy entire planets. No, entire systems, in an instant. It's not just a bomb or a missile. It's something far worse. And if they succeed, nothing will be able to stop them." Roland's mind raced as the weight of her words sank in. A weapon that could wipe out entire systems. That was the Dominion's endgame, no matter who they had to destroy to make it happen. "Where are they building it?" Vale asked, her voice steady. Lysandra's eyes flicked to her. "You're not getting that information just yet, but I'll help you get there. I know how to get inside their most secure facility, the one where they're building it. But you're going to need more than just the two of you." Roland's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you can't do this alone. Not even with your ship," Lysandra said. "You'll need an army, or at least a team who knows how to fight the Dominion from the inside." Roland sighed, his mind already racing through possibilities. allies, ships, equipment. They were going to need everything they could get their hands on if they had any hope of stopping the Dominion's plan. "We'll get what we need," Roland said, determination creeping into his voice. "But we need that information. We need to know how to get inside." Lysandra studied him for a long moment, her eyes calculating. Then, finally, she stood and moved to a nearby console, typing quickly on the keys. A map of the Dominion's facility appeared on the screen, showing a complex network of tunnels and reinforced walls. "There's a weak spot," she said, pointing at a specific location on the map. "If you can breach this area, you'll get access to the heart of the facility. But be warned, getting in won't be easy. The Dominion security is unlike anything you've faced before." Roland looked at the map, his mind already working through the plan. This was it, the key to taking down the Dominion. They had a chance, maybe their only chance, to stop them before it was too late. "Thanks, Lysandra," Roland said. "You've just given us a fighting chance." She didn't respond at first, but then she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Don't waste it." As they turned to leave, Roland felt a surge of hope. They were close now, closer than ever before, to taking the fight to the heart of the Dominion. But as they made their way back to the ship, Roland knew one thing for certain. Nothing would be easy. The real battle was just beginning. The air was thick with anticipation as Roland and Vale made their way back to the ship. Lysandra had provided them with a plan. A dangerous one, but a plan nonetheless. The map she had given them showed the weak point in the Dominion's secure facility, and they would need to act quickly if they were going to stop the weapon before it was completed. Roland glanced at Vale, who was walking beside him, her face set in a mask of determination. There was no turning back now. The fate of countless lives rested on what they were about to do. "We're ready," Roland said, his voice steady. Vale didn't reply, but the fire in her eyes spoke volumes. She was ready for whatever came next, no matter how dangerous. She had been fighting the Dominion for so long that she no longer feared the odds stacked against them. The thought of failure was something she pushed aside, focusing only on what needed to be done. As they entered the ship, Cale was waiting for them, his face grim. "You have the information?" he asked, his tone serious. Roland nodded. Lysandra came through. "We have a way in." Cale studied him for a moment, then turned toward the cockpit. "Good. We'll need to move fast. The Dominion won't give us much time once we make our move." Roland followed Cale into the cockpit, where the controls hummed to life under Cale's expert touch. The ship lifted off with ease, cutting through the barren landscape of the moon. They were heading for the Dominion's facility now, at least as close as they could get without triggering an alarm. "We'll have to make the final approach stealthily," Cale said, his eyes scanning the display screens. "The Dominion has long-range sensors. If they spot us early, we'll never get close enough to the facility." "We won't give them that chance," Roland said, his voice filled with resolve. As the ship soared through space, Roland could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. They had one shot at this, one shot to stop the weapon the Dominion was building. If they failed, there would be no second chances. Vale stood beside him, her gaze focused on the stars outside the window. Roland knew she was thinking the same thing. The risk of failure was too great to ignore, but they had come this far together, and there was no going back. "We're getting close," Cale said, his fingers flying over the controls. "Prepare for a rough landing. Once we're down, we'll move quickly. No delays." The ship's engines whined as they began to descend toward the facility's outskirts. Roland's mind raced as he double-checked his gear. They would need everything they had, and more, to make it through this. "Stay sharp," Roland said, his voice low. "The Dominion won't be easy to fight." Vale gave him a single nod, her expression unreadable. She was always ready for a fight. She had trained for this moment for years, and now it was finally here. The ship landed with a soft thud, the ground beneath them shaking slightly. The doors slid open, and Roland was the first to step out, his weapon drawn and ready. He motioned for Vale to follow, and the two of them moved quickly and quietly across the rocky terrain, making their way toward the facility's weak point. The facility loomed ahead, a massive structure of steel and reinforced walls. Guard towers were stationed at every corner, and armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter. This would not be easy. "We'll enter through the ventilation system," Roland said, pointing to a small, discreet vent near the base of the facility. "It's our best chance to get inside unnoticed." Vale glanced at the vent, then back at him. "Let's do it." They moved swiftly, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection. Roland's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the vent. He motioned for Vale to wait, then carefully removed the cover. The smell of old machinery and metal filled the air as he climbed inside, followed by Vale. The narrow passageway led deeper into the facility, and Roland kept his senses sharp as they moved through the labyrinth of ducts and tunnels. Every sound echoed in the quiet space, making it harder to keep their movements stealthy. Finally, they reached a maintenance door. Roland checked the control panel and found it unguarded. He silently opened the door, revealing a small storage room filled with crates and equipment. "This is it," Roland whispered. "We're inside." They slipped out of the storage room and into a corridor. The hum of machinery and distant voices signaled that they were getting closer to the heart of the facility. "Stay low," Roland murmured, leading the way. They moved cautiously through the halls, avoiding patrols and security cameras. Roland felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him, but he knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every moment brought them closer to the Dominion's weapon, and to the risk of everything they had worked for falling apart. Finally, they reached the central chamber, where the weapon was being constructed. The room was massive, filled with rows of machines and technicians working around the clock. In the center of the room, a giant, glowing core pulsed ominously. The weapon was close to completion. "There it is," Vale whispered, her voice tight with anger. "We stop this, or everything we fought for means nothing." Roland nodded, his jaw set. "We end this now." They moved quickly, taking out the guards stationed around the chamber without raising any alarms. Roland's heart raced as he approached the core, his fingers flying over the control panel in an attempt to disable the weapon. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. With one final keystroke, the system blinked, then went dark. The weapon was offline. But just as they thought it was over, the facility's alarms blared to life. "They know we're here," Vale said, her voice urgent. "We've got to get out. Now." Roland turned to her, a grim smile on his face. "We've got what we came for. Let's get out of here." As they raced toward the exit, the sound of Dominion soldiers' footsteps echoed behind them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. With the weapon destroyed, the Dominion would be forced to regroup, but they wouldn't stop. Roland knew that the fight had just begun. The mission wasn't over, but they had taken the first step, and that was enough for now.